Hi, I'm Conor Friedersdorf, a staff writer at the Atlantic magazine.
And I'm Noah Smith of the blog Noahpinion.
And we got some good stuff to talk about today. Why don't we start by talking about libertarianism? Because you are a sometimes critic of it, or at least of movement libertarianism, and although I don't necessarily call myself a libertarian because I shy away from all titles, I'm certainly very sympathetic to libertarianism, and I can see how an outsider would describe my views that way if they had to pick a label. So let me start by asking you, what's your critique? What are libertarians getting wrong?
Well, I think that the main thing that libertarians have gotten wrong is the relative magnitude of threats to liberty. You know, I certainly care about liberty a lot, and my definition of it would be pretty similar to most people's, I think. But you see a lot of libertarians basically with this idea that things like taxes, things like regulation, and then things like seatbelt laws are the biggest threats to personal liberty, when in fact there are much larger threats on the horizon that are often perpetrated by libertarians' political allies, at least in America right now. So, things like executive arbitrary detention, or limits on the right to demonstrate, and things like that. Even media intimidation during the Bush years. And so I think that it really annoyed me to see people still talking about as if taxes and regulation were the main threats to personal liberty.
Right. Well, I agree with you that there's a lot more to liberty than taxes and regulation. I think that I'm curious, actually. I want to get into the stuff on the federal level about indefinite detention and the whole universe of war on terror issues. But I wonder if you feel that way at the state level, too. For example, do you think it makes sense for a libertarian living in the state of California, when he's voting for a governor or a state legislator, to ally with Republicans, or that even then Democrats are maybe better if you have what you regard as the right mindset toward the magnitude of different issues?
Well, I think it's pretty situational, but I think when you look at the broad pattern of what the Republican Party has tried to do over the last 30 years or so of the Republican Party, even, at the state level, it's often been kind of what I would characterize as being anti-liberty as well. You've seen purges of voters, you've seen, you've seen support for a lot, things like institutionalized racism and things like that. Now, I do think that the libertarian movement does have a few things wrong on principle. But I'm saying even if it were getting everything right on principle, I think sometimes the priorities are wrong. At the state level, it's very situational. Every state has different issues, so that's a hard question to answer.
Right. Yeah. Well, this is very controversial within libertarianism, whether right-leaning libertarians ally themselves too much with the Republican Party. I tend to agree that they do on a very basic level. In 2008, I wanted Obama to win precisely because of the pro-civil liberties stances and anti-executive power stances that he was taking. One of the hobby horses that you'll see conservative bloggers trot out is that democratic policies are going to put us on a road to serfdom, or we're going to go on a path to tyranny.
Right.
And as I see it, locking people up without trial is tyranny itself. There's no road to it. That's what it is. That's the thing you're essentially trying to avoid.
You're taking the elevator.
At the same time, at the same time, though, it doesn't seem like that worked out very well for people like me who supported President Obama for those reasons. As best I can tell, he's been better on a few things, like getting rid of torture, which is, I don't want to minimize at all. He's also been worse on some things, like assassinating Americans without any kind of trial or due process. And so it seems to me that at the national level, obviously this changes with different presidents and from time to time, so I don't want to make a statement about Republicans and Democrats generally. But at this moment right now, Democrats don't seem to me clearly better on these issues than Republicans.
I think that is really not right. Yes, I've been very disappointed by Obama, and I'm pretty upset. And still, at the same time, you see that the recent National Defense Authorization Act, which was supported by every single Republican but only a few Democrats, and basically codified executive arbitrary detention. That was something Obama argued against, said he didn't want. Signed in the end. But it was really a Republican initiative and something Republicans pressed very hard for, and obviously that a lot of Democrats were resisting. So I don't think there's really a comparison on civil liberties.
I think that's a little bit off in that, as I understood it, the real sticking point between Republicans and President Obama on the National Defense Authorization Act was whether or not the president was going to have the power to decide in what kind of detention someone was held. So, in other words, President Obama wanted to be able to do with detainees whatever he wanted. He wanted to have the prerogative to hold them indefinitely in military detention. He also wanted to have the prerogative to hold them in civilian detention. The Republicans were saying, no, we don't want to, in this one instance, out of everything in the world, we don't want to give the president power to do whatever he wants. We want to say you have to hold these people in military detention. You can't hold them in civilian detention. And as someone who wants them to be held in civilian detention and often given civilian trials, I more agree with Obama on that narrow sticking point. But Obama was in fact asserting that he should have the power to hold people indefinitely without trial, and he didn't campaign on that. He's changed his mind about that, but he nevertheless thinks now that he should have that power. And so I'm not sure that the sticking point about whether the president should have the prerogative to do that or not is a very big deal in the grand scheme of liberty.
Well, all I can say is to claim that, it's a very odd claim to make that the president demands the power to switch people from military to civilian detention. Congress denies it and forces the president to put people in military detention. It's very odd, in my view, to spin that as a win for liberty because it's a restriction on presidential power. In this case, the power the president was seeking is the power to say, no, these people are going to civilian detention instead of military detention, and the Republicans are saying, no, you must put them in military detention. To say that, to force the president to put American citizens in military detention, to spin that as a limit on presidential power and hence a win for liberty is a little... Well, I don't know. I can't buy it.
I don't think, to be clear, I don't think that what happened was a win for liberty. I think that the positions of both sides were wrong. I also think that both sides were claiming the power to put people in detention without end, without charges, without trial, and so. That's my only point, that President Obama's position is terrible, and compared to having the power to put someone in indefinite detention, whether you hold them in a civilian facility or a military facility, I don't know that really matters all that much.
But doesn't it?
But
I mean, what about the Supreme Court decision for Jose Padilla versus the Supreme Court decision for the Guantanamo detainees? I mean, that's military versus civilian detention right there. Bush tried to detain someone indefinitely in civilian detention, and they said, no, you must charge him with something, bring him to trial in the civilian courts. They did not force the same thing with the Guantanamo detainees, so it does seem to make a big difference to me.
If there is a later distinction in the due process someone enjoys, then I would agree with you that it makes a big difference. And that wasn't my understanding, but I could be wrong about that. It's been a while since I've looked into the details.
Let me not say that Obama is a saint on this issue. I'm not trying to, make a defense of Obama. I am mad at him too. I just think that the Republicans are a lot worse. I mean, and again, I'm not making a lesser of two evils argument for voting for Obama either. I'm just very, very upset at the Republicans.
Yeah, I guess what I would say is that is the average Democratic senator better on these issues than the average Republican senator? I don't know, because there aren't that many senators. Is the average Democratic House member better? I would think probably yes, that they are. I think Rand Paul is one of the best people on these issues, and I guess my defense of libertarians on these issues would be that Rand Paul is in fact not allying himself by party on these things. Ron Paul certainly didn't take the quote-unquote Republican position on these things, and the Libertarian Party nominee Gary Johnson hasn't taken that issue on these things. So I guess I would say that if you're voting for a senator, it just depends on who that person is, what party you should vote for. If you care about civil liberties, I think that sometimes it is a Republican that you should vote for, and Rand Paul is the example that I would cite. I think that if you're voting for president, I guess the point I want to make is if you're voting for president, it isn't clear to me that Romney is worse than Obama on civil liberties issues. I haven't heard him take a position that sounds to me worse, with the exception of at some points complaining about torture in the past, complaining about getting rid of it, complaining about calling waterboarding torture. But I don't think that his position is that he wants to bring that back. And in fact, I'm pretty sure he's on record not wanting to. So I guess what I want to ask you is, do you think that Romney is worse on these issues than Obama?
Absolutely not. Okay. In fact, Romney might even be a little bit better on these issues. But I guess my larger point is that to break these things down issue by issue is not necessarily, I mean, you can say, you can have all the right positions on an issue that people don't really get out and vote about, and then positions. So suppose libertarians care a lot about these kind of civil liberties, and suppose that's their most important thing, but that suppose most people care a lot more about, say, taxes and things like that. Well, then, if libertarians support and provide intellectual backing to and justification to Republican Party on tax issues and spend most of their time talking about that, and only a very little time talking about the civil liberties stuff on which people don't really vote anyway, then what I see happening is it's like low taxes, low taxes, low taxes, low taxes, and oh yeah, civil liberties too. I did article search in the Cato archives. I think this is a much bigger problem with libertarian think tanks than with individual writers. I looked at the Cato archives, and my rough estimate is that there were 10 articles about taxes and regulation to every one article about the security state, although there were articles about the security state, and they were all things I agreed with. But just the ratio and the focus was all on taxes and regulation. And when you look at who funds the Cato Institute, I don't think that's much of a surprise. I mean, I one time said that the difference between a libertarian and a civil libertarian is you can't make a living being a civil libertarian. So, I think it's partly that funding issue, but I think it's partly just a legacy of the 1970s when there wasn't this big security state, but there was a lot more regulation, a lot higher taxes. And I think it's taken a long time for libertarians to kind of understand that that's not the biggest threat anymore.
I don't know. I mean, I think that if I were running the Cato Institute and I just had this pile of money that I could divvy up however I wanted, I would have a slightly different mix of issues that I think would skew in a direction that someone like you, from what I understand of your opinions, would be happy about. I don't think it's quite fair to characterize them as spending most of their time on taxes and a little bit of time on national security stuff, only because on other domestic issues, it seems to me that they are taking pro-liberty positions. The stuff that someone like Julian Sanchez does on privacy policy and IP law and secrecy, and writing about things like the warrantless wiretaps and the FISA courts and all those kinds of issues. Cato has done a bunch of stuff about domestic policing and the militarization of police and the drug war. It's done a bunch of stuff on lots of different kinds of regulations that are really important and affect a lot of people, such as, the same kind of professional licensing stuff that that the Institute for Justice works on, where, forcing poor people to get a license in order to become an interior decorator or a barber or to braid hair, that kind of thing. So I think that taxes and business regulation, the kinds of things you would expect from an organization that was funded by wealthy right-leaning businessmen. Cato definitely does a lot of that stuff. I think they also do a lot of other stuff, and I guess if I am looking at an organization that I'm going to give money to, if I'm looking at a presidential candidate that I want to vote for, the claim I'm making is just that the libertarian organizations or the libertarian candidates are going to be better than the Democrat or the Republican, not that libertarians should always ally themselves with Republicans.
Right. And I agree with you about a lot of those issues you mentioned, and I think that it's good that people have, that libertarians have focused on that. I just think that in the mind of the intellectual reading public, of the people who read the news, there's very little doubt that the libertarian movement is allied with the conservative movement far more than with the liberal movement. I think that that's, to claim otherwise is just going to have a lot of people, kind of arching their eyebrows. And I think, and although I have some philosophical critiques of libertarianism, I think those are to the side. And the main critique I have with it is that libertarians pretty clearly allowed themselves to become an adjunct to the conservative movement over the past 30 years. I doubt many people would dispute that. So, I mean, maybe that's changing. Maybe the fight between the Koch brothers and the Cato Institute, the recent fight, is signifying a break with that, and maybe the egregious security state violations under Bush have changed a few people's minds. Although I certainly think libertarians are a lot more vocal about their opposition to the security state under Obama than they were under Bush, even though Bush was worse. And
right. So again, granting some of your critique. In other words, I agree with you to an extent that the relationship between the Republican Party and libertarians is cozier than I would like it to be. I think that Brink Lindsay and Will Wilkinson were correct in a lot of the things they were saying when they were working on the notion of libertarianism.
Right.
I also think that they were right when they were arguing that there should be a libertarianism, that there should be liberals that ally themselves with libertarian candidates and causes. And I don't see that happening. And it seems to me, I don't think it's very realistic that the Libertarian Party is ever going to replace one of the two major parties in the United States. The reason for that is that when third parties historically get popular, the other two parties co-opt their issues, and then they fade away because the reason that a lot of people were supporting them has been incorporated into the Democratic or the Republican parties. That's what I want to happen. I want libertarian candidates to be getting enough votes that people think that, oh, wow, Americans actually care about civil liberties. Americans actually care about these things. I'm going to, I, a Republican, I, a Democrat, am going to pay attention to these issues and not think that I can just, in Obama's case, pay lip service to them and then completely reverse myself. And it seems to me that Democrats are right now doing the exact same thing that you accuse libertarians of doing, which is to incorrectly value the various issues that are on the table. In other words, Democrats don't want the healthcare reforms that they've passed to go away. They want a federal government that is friendlier to public employee unions than the Republicans would have. They want their way on various entitlements, and they don't want Republicans to get their way on entitlements. And because of this, they're willing to keep quiet about really egregious violations of civil liberties, and they're willing to stick with Obama, despite the fact that he has done these things that much of the left regarded as abhorrent during the Bush administration. He's gone farther in some cases than what the Bush administration did, and still there is much less outcry from the left on these things. And so I guess while I grant that the right undervalues these things and behaves in ways that makes it seem like they don't care about them enough, it seems to me like the left is doing exactly the same thing, and that there is no move away from Obama to support a guy like Gary Johnson, who of course has little to no chance of winning the election, but who is a social liberal and who is perfect on all of the civil liberties issues, and who disagrees with the left about the size of government in a way that isn't radical. And so why isn't he getting support from liberals?
And well, so my answer to that in brief is, my critique of libertarians is you're not being libertarian enough in some sense, and your critique of liberals is you're not being libertarian enough. Fine, but that's not what. At the end of the day, you're going to have people who care more about entitlements than about any kind of liberty, and those people are going to find a home in whatever
about taxes.
Right, and so I'm saying you're going to have conservatives who care more about lower taxes, deregulation, things like that, or about racial issues, social issues, and things like that, which is what I think a lot of conservatives care about chiefly these days. But what I really think is, here you have libertarians, and I'm not saying libertarians should ditch the Republican Party and ally with the Democratic Party, in the way that they were sort of allied with the Republican Party for the past 30 years. I don't think that they should shift their alliance to the Democratic Party. I still think they should be independent. But when they, in the issue emphasis, basically I'm not saying go ally with the Democrats. I'm saying stop allying with the Republicans as much as you've been doing. That's my big critique. Do you kind of see what I'm saying?
Yeah, I absolutely see what you're saying.
I mean, I agree with you about liberals, and I guess I get really mad, at liberals.
I mean, I guess I just think that. I think there's also a distinction between libertarian voters and the libertarian movement.
Yeah.
In some ways, I think that the libertarian movement is better on these issues than libertarian voters sometimes, or at least voters who would call themselves libertarians. I mean, during the Bush administration, for example, libertarians were generally in favor of the Bush tax cuts. But Reason Magazine and Cato were hammering the Bush administration on spending. The Cato Institute was against the Iraq War. Most of the people there were against the Iraq War. The Patriot Act is another thing that Reason and Cato are both against. So I guess I think that there isn't quite the alliance isn't maybe quite as tight as some people think it is, and beyond that, there is a Libertarian Party. So there clearly isn't. A lot of libertarians de facto vote Republican, and a lot of people in the Tea Party would call themselves libertarians, even though they're basically down the line partisan Republicans. But there's in fact a much smaller number of people who back the Libertarian Party, and there is a Libertarian Party and a Libertarian Party candidate and a Libertarian Party platform, and the Libertarian Party has all kinds of its own problems. It's like any political organization, it's very imperfect and has pathologies and all of the rest. But so I guess my critique of the left would just be that I think that this specific Libertarian Party candidate, Gary Johnson, I think has a mix of views that ought to appeal to a lot more liberals than it does. Not everyone in the Democratic Party, but a lot more people than he will ever realistically attract. And I think that the reason he won't attract them is because Democrats put too much weight on narrow areas of domestic policy.
Or, I mean, also just because everyone remembers what happened with Nader. So people understand we have a two-party system, and people understand that voting for a third party may express your views more, but, achieves your desired outcome less. So people understand that, I think, pretty well. And that's another reason. But I see libertarian writers. I read, a lot of what they write. And there's a lot of self-professed libertarians in economics. And nobody ever talks about Gary Johnson. I mean, I know the man's name, but I've heard it mentioned on the internet once, twice, ever. And I read a lot of things that people write. I read everything Will Wilkinson writes. He's not that doctrinaire libertarian, but I mean, I read a lot of people who think of themselves libertarians. I've never heard anyone mention Gary Johnson, really ever.
Really?
Yeah, I've never heard it ever. I have about the Libertarian Party. I've heard almost nothing since I was a kid. I remember back in 1984, I was 3, I think, and I remember there was a libertarian candidate. It was the first election I could comprehend. Since then, nothing. Also, by the way, but anyway, I'm sorry.
Oh, I was just going to say, I'm subletting a place right now in near the beach in Orange County, and I was walking down there several weekends ago, and there was like Ron Paul people set up in a booth, and big Ron Paul signs, and there were a couple of high school aged girls who were the daughters of some of the people there at the rally, who were holding up big poster boards with marijuana leaves on them. And people are driving by on Coast Highway, and I was just thinking, this is not the image that you want to be putting out there, libertarians. Damn it. I guess Ron Paul is running as a Republican at the moment, but his supporters that I talked to there were all identifying as libertarians, and I happen to be for legalizing marijuana, and certainly for medical marijuana, which was the cause they were talking about. And it turned out that there was, one of the parents was sick with cancer and needed marijuana, and so there was a much more sympathetic story behind the immediate image, or one that would resonate with people a lot more than I think what they saw as they were driving by did. But I do think that libertarianism has this problem where there are a lot of people who have libertarian ideas and beliefs and vote Democratic or Republican because they make a judgment about which realistic coalition is better for them. And the effect of that is to leave the people who are voting libertarian more extreme and less cognizant of how they're perceived on the outside as they would be if the Libertarian Party were actually competing to win elections and having to govern and having to make compromises and having to attract a big tent and whatever. Right. So I don't know if that ever changes, but it's definitely a problem. And I guess I wonder, I should also say that my advocacy for Gary Johnson strikes a lot of people as kind of quixotic because he has no chance of winning, and I grant that. I guess the place where I'm at is that I don't think that I think a frightening number of Americans don't care about these issues. I think that so few people do that it makes sense for them to prioritize them, and I don't know that even doing that would have any chance of success. I think the odds against it are very long. But as I survey American policy, and having just elected a Democratic president who took all of the terrible things that Republicans were doing and sort of made them the bipartisan consensus, I'm casting around for what to do if you care about these issues, and I don't really see a lot of options. And I wonder, maybe you see different options than I do, or better options. I would love to hear about them if you do.
I think that the most important thing is simply to talk about it. People care about, what they're thinking about, and putting it in people's minds. I don't think if Americans were thinking more about the security state and what it means, I think that they would tolerate it a lot less. I think that the reason they tolerate it is because it doesn't get in their face so much. And
Right.
and so simply bringing awareness, I mean, not even voting, not even electoral politics, but simply issue advocacy is the key here. And the libertarian label, I think, is we've got to change what that means. And when I say we, I really mean they, or libertarians, because I'm not counted as one of them.
Yeah.
But so, I mean, right now you have a whole lot of people in the Republican Party, a whole lot of people in the conservative movement who say I'm libertarian and who aren't really on the same page at all as Gary Johnson or as people who've thought about what that means a little bit more, I think. And you don't have any Democrats or liberals saying I'm a libertarian, even though a lot of things they would probably agree with Gary Johnson or intellectual libertarian more with, and that needs to change. The libertarian label has got, in the public consciousness, has got to stop meaning, just a weird kind of Republican. Right now, libertarian is to Republican as like Alawite is to Shia. Nobody really knows who the Alawites are, but they know they're sort of Shiite. They're just sort of weird Shiite. And libertarian, the label, has got to stop meaning weird Republican and in the public consciousness. And that's part of issue advocacy. And I think the more libertarians hammer on the issues of national security, whether they're criticizing Obama or whether they're criticizing Republicans or even apart from the partisan thing, just talking about the issue itself, the more they talk about that and the less they talk about taxes, the more people are going to stop thinking of libertarians as just weird Republicans and start thinking of them as people with ideas. And the parties will try to co-opt them more. And yes, the parties will succeed in co-opting them more. But my bet is that this time, as opposed to the era of Reagan, this time, if libertarians really stick up against the security state, you're going to see the Democratic Party doing more of that anti-security state co-opting than the Republican Party. I could be wrong. Maybe the Republican Party will turn strongly against the security state. I'd love to see that. I would dance in the streets and people would look at me funny. But I just think my instinct says if it's going to be anyone who co-opts the anti-security state position, it's going to be the Democrats. And so libertarians should be talking about that much more, even if it's Obama in the presidency right now doing some of the bad stuff.
It's interesting that, it's so hard to imagine Republicans doing that right now, turning against the security state. And yet there were glimmers of that during the Clinton administration with a strain of Republicans who were furious at the raid on Waco and who, were terrified of Janet Reno and even anti-war when Bill Clinton was going into the Balkans. I guess the two things that I would want to see, and maybe we should move on to another topic after this, but I would love to see in the current race, and this is a pipe dream again, but I would love it if enough left-leaning civil libertarians, because most civil libertarians are left-leaning, would appreciate the importance of these issues being talked about enough to want to opportunistically try to get Gary Johnson into the presidential debates. The Presidential Debate Commission, it's a 15% threshold that you have to be pulling at in order to be invited. It seems to me that if you're a Democrat, and probably the Republicans have more to lose from Gary Johnson being there, because of the dynamic that you've discussed about, he's very low tax, very small government. People are dissatisfied with Romney for those reasons. I don't actually know what the political implications of it would be. Maybe it's just too hard to predict. But I would love to see, and if not that particular thing, I would love to see opportunistic things like that aren't Democrats completely abandoning the Democratic Party or stopping to care about the disagreements. But I guess I just want to see more ad hoc opportunistic alliances on issues of common ground and less sort of down the line coalition voting on everything.
I mean, I tend to think more in terms of ideas and advocacy because I'm not involved in politics at all. I don't even, follow horse races as much as some people. I'm all about, I'm coming from the academic, econ sort of side of things. So you can see how my thinking is. I think of ideas and issues first, and then coalitions and people second. But
right, yeah, and if you think about how politics, if you think about how politics originates at the local level, this is one reason why libertarians so often end up supporting Republicans, because at the local level, at the city level, libertarians, you'll have a lot of libertarians who are people who are self-employed, who are running their own businesses, and at the local level, it is Republicans who are protecting them from what they consider, I think, often reasonably to be overly onerous regulations, and who are generally sort of standing up and saying, no, you shouldn't do these government overreaches that seem ridiculous. You shouldn't make it so that kids can't sell lemonade stands on the corner. You shouldn't make it so that soda is banned above a certain size. You shouldn't restrict our freedom in these ways. And I agree that those issues aren't nearly so important as, indefinite detention, as executive assassinations, as all these things. My only point is that when you accustom yourself to parties, you're doing it at the state level and at the local level as well as at the national level. And so at the state and local level, you're not having to make that trade-off about national security issues. You're just looking at domestic issues. And if you're just looking at domestic issues, I think that the Libertarian-Republican alliance makes a lot more sense. And so I guess that's another reason why I just think that we should separate these things out and not have a consistent partisan alliance and be a lot more opportunistic and ad hoc about it.
Right. All right. So instead of quibbling about that, why don't we go on to a new issue?
So why don't you lay out your theory? You wrote a post about college and why people go to college and what it's about. And the setup was basically that a lot of people argue that college is just signaling. And you wanted to say, no, it's not just signaling. And why don't you lay out your argument?
Right. So the signaling idea has gotten a lot of cachet. A lot of people like it. I'd say most economists believe it. And the intuition behind it is, hey, I'm not using this stuff that I learned in college classes on the job. Why did I spend all that time learning, all that physics or whatever? And I think that's where the signaling idea comes from. But people have been so eager to embrace this that they haven't, I don't think, have thought about it quite carefully enough. So first of all, there's the question of what's being signaled. A lot of the credentialing of college comes from simply getting into a place, not necessarily the grades you get when you're there. So, you went to Stanford, you must be smart, kind of thing. But you don't really need to go to Stanford to prove you're smart. You can just take some tests to prove you're smart. So it doesn't make sense that people would, that you need 4 years of classes just to prove you're smart. There is a good argument to be made for the idea that college proves that you're hardworking and you have perseverance, and that. So what the signaling model really is it's about jumping through hoops. It's saying jump through some hoops just to prove you've got what it takes. That's signaling in a nutshell. And but the hoop jumping would be pointless if you didn't have to prove yourself. Now, 4 years is a lot to spend proving you're smart. You could probably do it in a week. Maybe you spend 4 years proving that you are working hard and persevering through classes. So I definitely think that that's part of it. But then when you look at countries like Japan, where people really don't do much hard work in college at all compared to Americans, and are expected to simply party, and when you think about the fact that Americans in the old days didn't spend much of their time studying in college as much as they do now, you think maybe there's something besides just hard work that college is proving. So if the college isn't for proving hard work and proving intelligence, what is college really for proving? And I can't really think of anything. On the other hand, when people talk about human capital, the value of your value as a worker, basically. They usually talk about things you learn in classes, practical skills, how to code in Python or something. But they don't think as much about much more intangible things, like, do I have the perspective to know what all my outside options are and to know what I could really be doing in life? do I have the motivation to keep me working hard? That motivation, I think, is really the key. And of course, there's social capital. Do I have networks, of people that I can, and a lot of people have done research showing human networks are important. But so my post, a lot of it was explaining how I think college adds to people's motivation. So I could go into that if you want. Would you like me to recap that?
Yeah, why don't you, I thought that was interesting, so why don't you go ahead with it?
So I think that smart people in rich countries who go to college have unique characteristics, and one of their unique characteristics is they're very motivated by their parents, usually. You and I both know millions of examples of people who excel in high school because their mom is pushing them, or just to please their parents in general, even if their parents don't actively push them. So when people get away from their parents, they can easily lose motivation. And I think that the way to keep your motivation is to replace your parents with new relationships, friends, eventually a lover, and a spouse and kids. That's what replaces parents in terms of motivation. I think people really need those relationships. But for smart people, it's hard. It's not only hard because you're so close to your parents when you're a kid, but it's also hard because smart people are kind of a minority, and to form friendships and romantic relationships with people you really click with, you need to do it with people who are kind of on the same page as you, who are also nerds in a way. And so it's hard to meet those people because they're rare just in general society. I mean, try living in a big city, it's a little hard to meet nerdy people, but at college it's really easy because that's everyone. And so at college you meet people who are like you. There's this sorting aspect. You meet people you click with, and that helps you much more quickly establish, the kind of relationships that will motivate you down the line and make you, continue to work hard and not get burned out and not get depressed and not feel lonely and not become one of these gifted underachievers that everyone knows about. I think that's it.
Yeah, I think you touch on a lot of things that strike me as true. And so I was thinking about whether I think that it's mostly a signaling thing or not. And
I'm sorry.
One of the,
I couldn't hear you. You're getting quiet.
Oh, I was saying that I was thinking about whether I was thinking about how much signaling is a part of this, and I think that I have another signal that is being sent, and maybe this is incorporated in your argument, or maybe not. But my idea is basically this: that there are certain kinds of firms that recruit heavily on college campuses, and economic consulting firms is a classic example. And I think that for these sort of high-power, right out of college jobs where you have a relatively high salary, and I think it's the same thing with law firms that are recruiting from certain law schools. I think one of the things that they're looking for is someone who is someone who wants to be on a track, right? Someone who likes having things set up for them in a way that is much like school, in a way that is much like the transition from high school to college, where you have these specific goals and you're on this track and you want to achieve at the highest level, and you're motivated by the ability to grab the gold ring. And what they don't want is someone like Bill Gates or Mark Zuckerberg, say, who is willing to sort of drop out and do their own thing and try and make it in a different way. So, in other words, they wouldn't want someone who's brilliant if they didn't have these other qualities, because they want someone who is going to dedicate their lives to this job, who's going to work 60 or 70 hours, who's going to try to make partner, who's going to fit into this idea of, reaching the top of the meritocratic elite, getting to, trying to achieve whatever is put before them. And I guess being someone who is motivated by external prizes more than internal ones, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. I think that I think there are certain college resumes, there are certain colleges you attend that signal that you have that quality, and that's a quality that you couldn't signal just by taking a test to prove you're brilliant. You couldn't signal even by going to an easy college and showing you're brilliant by sliding through with good grades, right? In order to signal this thing, you have to, or at least a signal of this thing is that you went through all of the tremendous trouble and effort that it took in order to jump through all the hoops to go to Harvard or to go to Princeton or to go to wherever. And so I think that kind of signaling is going on. And I'm still actually mulling it over in my mind and trying to articulate it better. But do you agree or disagree with that?
Well, I think that it could be that if that kind of thing were hard to observe in the first place. Remember, signals, when you're talking about costly signals, jumping through hoops, the only reason you spend this effort that would otherwise be waste is because it's very hard to prove. You have to basically waste some of your effort proving stuff that ideally would just be spent on working. Now, I think that in the case of these kind of on-track people that you're talking about, I think you're absolutely right. But first of all, the Bill Gateses and the Mark Zuckerbergs of the world don't want to work at Accenture. They don't want to work at McKinsey. They want to do their own thing, and they're going to do their own thing. And the consulting companies don't have to worry about buying a lemon, because they're not going to buy a lemon. Everyone knows what it means to work at one of those companies, and the people who go for those companies are I think, generally very well matched. So I think that when you see those companies recruiting on college campuses, it's not because because the signals have been sent. They're recruiting on the college campuses because that's where the people are. If you want groceries, you go to the grocery store. If you want on-track people, you go to the on-track people store, which are some of these companies. Right. And so I think it could be what you're talking about, but I don't think it needs to be. I don't think that's why we need college, and I think that those people, those companies could find the people they need without college very easily.
Yeah, and you don't think that it would be nearly as easy for smart people to find the kind of people that expand their horizons and add value to them in various ways without college.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. Right. So online education is not going to cut it in those terms. You can learn skills with online education. I mean, I learn much more rapidly with online education when it comes to just programming in some language or something. But the college, I can't even remember what I was like before it.
Mm-hmm. So I totally agree with you that that college benefits the individual in this way, that it helps various individuals
and society
to find people who are like them. I'm less certain that it helps society, and I guess I wouldn't dispute the societal benefits that you cite. I would just say that I think that there are costs associated with this sort of perfect sorting too, and that I've been reading Chris Hayes's book about, it's called Twilight of the Elites, and it's about the various elite failures we've seen in American life over the last decade. And one of the points that he makes, and I hope I'm not mangling it, is that social distance between elites and the people that they're presiding over is a problem and makes them worse at making decisions that are going to be good for everyone, both because they tend to be self-interested and interested mostly in the benefits of people like them, and also because they just don't understand what life is like for other people.
Right.
And so I think that if everyone, if you can imagine college, you can imagine college sorting even slightly better than it does now, sorting people into these various things. And maybe there's something very important of coming of age in a way that people used to, with very different kinds of people. And to sort of to give a specific example of that, you can think of the World War II generation, where a ton of people had this experience of either being drafted or enlisting and going off to fight war in units that had lots of different kinds of people. Mm-hmm. And even if you were, sent off to fight with your buddies who were in the same regiment in North Dakota before the war, you were mixing with different officers that were coming in for different places. You had people that had gone to college and officer candidate school, and also people who were coming off the farm and were never going to pursue education. And then all of those people came back to the United States and pursued, a lot of them pursued the GI Bill, which put a bunch of people in college together who never would have otherwise been in college together. It was just an insanely different mix that was in college in 1938 and in 1946. And I think, I certainly wouldn't claim that I have enough information to say that was, that added this much value to the United States. But I think there's at least investigation-worthy argument to be made that that was important, and that made those people, it made the people who rose to the top more conscious of different kinds of people and better stewards of whatever organizations that they were running.
That's the real argument against sorting that I've heard, and I do worry about it. I wonder how much, if the kind of mixing between different, not even different income classes of people, or but just people with different interests, like nerdy people and non-nerdy people. I wonder how much, if that mixing would be optimal if it's just random instead of with some kind of guiding force like the Army. World War II isn't going to happen again, I hope. The Army's one thing, but look at high school. That's a place where you have nerds and non-nerds meet up a lot, and the meeting does not always go well, if you remember high school.
Right.
And so, to a certain extent, after college, I started missing the non-elite people, and it was good to get out of college and reconnect with the non-elite people for me too. So I think that for me, balance was very good for me, and it would be interesting if we were to develop some institution without sending a million people off to fight a war that could provide that balance. That would be cool. But in terms of do you see what I mean? How random throwing people in is not quite the same.
Yeah, absolutely. I think maybe that if I guess maybe a realistic fix would be for us to value when we're choosing various elites, when we're choosing someone to run a federal agency or to be president, for that matter, we ought to put more value on experiences that would give them insight into how organizations work at the bottom, into how the ideas that they're trying to push from the top down would actually play out at the lowest levels. So maybe in this kind of world, Mitt Romney's experience as a Mormon missionary would be something that he would really try to explain as giving him this experience, and maybe Obama would cite his time as a community organizer. And as candidates started having to talk about these things and try to demonstrate that they know how things work from the bottom up as well as the top down, ambitious people would seek out these kinds of opportunities more. Because I really think that there is a sense in which part of what it means to be an elite in America, part of what it means to go to good schools, part of what you're trying to do is skip over a lot of these initial steps, skip over the part where you work your way up from the bottom. I guess I just, I don't know how you would make it happen, but I have some notion that that skipping has a cost that is more than we are recognizing.
I agree. And I just, I was thinking about the benefits of college, not about the potential benefits of something else that, that gives elites an insight. And again, when I was thinking of elites, I wasn't really thinking of a government person or a federal kind of politician, sort of. I was thinking more along the lines of a Google engineer, you know, or someone like that. And but yeah, so I guess I was thinking of a different class of people. So I think you're right,
Yeah.
and I think that's an unsolved problem in our society. And yet I don't think that college is necessarily making it worse by doing what I'm talking about.
Right. Yeah, maybe not. I don't necessarily think so either. But yeah, in any case, I recommend that people read that post, which will be linked up on the sidebar. Yeah, and we've gone almost an hour, so probably it's time to stop. But I enjoyed it, and we should do it again
Great.
sometime.
Likewise, definitely. Been a pleasure.